So today we are going to talk about how to perfect manual mode. Now, this might be one of the hardest parts about photography. You can learn anything else like lighting, poses, games, all of that stuff means nothing if you have no idea how to work your camera. So in order to work manual mode, you need to understand three different things. And these three make up the exposure triangle, and it is aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. All three of these work together in order to create a properly exposed image in your camera. And I'll tell you exactly what each one of them does because not only do they all affect the lighting, but they also affect focus or how your image is produced in camera, whether it's grain or maybe it's blurred or anything like that. All three affect that. So you need to properly adjust all three of those in order to get a great looking image in camera. So why do we do manual mode over automatic? Well, there's a couple different reasons, but when we put our camera in automatic, we tell our camera, "Hey, we think that you are better equipped at figuring out this lighting situation than I am." So most of the time what's going to happen is your camera is going to have it's not going to have produce those quality looking images. What it's going to do is it's going to say like, okay, looking at all of this that you are showing me in the viewfinder, this is the brightest spot. So I know that we need to make sure that this is showing up and it's not blown out. And what happens is our subjects are a little too dark, or sometimes like it's all on one plane because our aperture is like way too high. So it just doesn't look like, it looks like a mom took it. Like a mom just with a camera, just snapping away with her camera. And sometimes those are absolutely beautiful. But in order for us to sit there and say that we want to charge and we want to be that next step up from just like a mom with a camera, we need to learn manual mode. And it's so important. Okay, so like I said, all of these three things affect lighting and focus. All right, you need to be able to properly set all three of these. And y'all, there is no magic setting. So when you guys like comment in like Facebook groups or you ask like other photographers or anything, like, "Hey, it's gonna be a cloudy day. What should my settings be?" Nobody's going to be able to tell you because it matters on so many different levels. It matters on where you are. Do you have natural reflectors? Are you by like something with open field? Are you casting a lot of shadows? What does a light situation look like? So there's no magic setting ever. Now, there are settings that I refuse to go below or go above just because I know that the quality won't be to my level. So I will tell you all about those as well in this live. But y'all, the biggest thing is like there is no magic number. So no photographer is going to be able to tell you like, "Hey, when it's cloudy, use XYZ settings and you'll have a beautiful image." That's just not how it works. But hopefully after this, you guys will be able to understand the exposure triangle a little bit better and you'll be able to make those decisions in camera or kind of know how to adjust things, okay? Again, I have all my notes right here, so hopefully I don't get off track. I do that a lot. So first that we are going to learn about is metering. So when you put your camera, when you hold your camera up, okay, you're gonna see a little bar at the bottom and it's gonna have like a little spot in the middle and that is a properly exposed image. So when you're messing with all of your settings, if the little dial is on the middle part, that means it's properly exposed. If it's a little bit to the left, that means it's underexposed. If it's a little to the right, that means it's overexposed. Me being a light and bright photographer, I like to overexpose my images most of the time. There's some instances where I want to underexpose it if like the sky is beautiful or anything like that. I'll maybe underexpose it a little bit, but normally I'm trying to properly expose or overexpose just a little bit. So how I set my camera is first I do my aperture and then I do my ISO and then I do my shutter speed. I've always done it this way. Ever since like I think like when I got my camera in 2012, I've always set it this way. So first we're going to talk about aperture. Aperture is how wide the camera lens opens up in order to allow light in, okay? So when our camera lens opens up really wide, and this is going to be like a number that's like 1.2, 1.8, like as those lower numbers like that, it means your camera lens is getting wide and it's allowing a lot of light to come through, okay? Imagine like a window. If you open just a little bit, it's only allowing a little bit of light. But if you completely open that window, a lot of light is going to be shining through. Um, so what this has done is it's not only allowed a lot of light, but it's also given that like pretty like blurry background. And the reason why it's becoming this pretty blurry background is because you have told your camera that when your aperture is that low, it's going to be a very small focal plane. So focal plane, if you can imagine, let's just say like you are looking straight ahead, right? And so if you are here, right, and your subjects are like about here, right, and you're shooting like this way, that means like this small little part is going to be in focus. So if anything moves, all right, if anything comes out of that focal plane, if they're not on a straight line when you're at a low aperture, they're going to be a little bit out of focus. The best way I can describe this is if you take a headshot of someone, all right, and you focus right on their eye at 1.8, what's going to happen is their nose is going to be a little bit blurry. Anything that is not on the same plane as their eyes, so maybe their eyebrows, their nose, their mouth, anything that is not on the same plane as their eyes is going to be a little bit out of focus at those lower numbers, all right? So again, so that is just, your aperture is going to affect light and depth of field. So because of this, when we have a lower aperture, you're going to have like a smaller window of things to be in focus. So as a family photographer, it's kind of hard to have like those lower apertures because kids move. Like that's just what they do. They're not going to stand there and be still. So I typically use those lower apertures for like adults or like senior pictures, or if a kid is like really good and they're like really still in single portraits, I'll do that. But other than that, I don't dip too low with that. And I'll talk more about like my camera settings and like my stuff later in the video. Right now, I just want to talk to you guys about that. Okay. So again, the lower your aperture, the more light that's going to be coming in. I set that first so I know exactly, and I set it as like my absolute minimum that I want to go. So let's say we do have a senior, okay, and I know I can dip to like 1.8. I'll set it at 1.8 and then adjust all my other settings, knowing that my aperture is at 1.8, okay? Then you have ISO. Now ISO is basically how sensitive your camera is going to be to light, all right? So a high ISO is going to make your camera super sensitive to the light, and a low ISO is going to make it not as sensitive, okay? So if you have a bright sunny day and you have your ISO at 800, your camera is not only is there a lot of light everywhere, but now your camera is ultra sensitive to the light. So it's going to be really, really bright, all right? So when it's a sunny day, I typically try and keep my aperture or my ISO as low as possible. And that is just my rule of thumb. I like to keep my ISO as low as possible because even though it makes your camera a little bit more sensitive to light, it also, with those high ISO numbers, it creates grain in your image or noise. So if you've ever taken a picture and you have your ISO at like 800 or 1600, what's going to happen is you're going to see little speckles and little grain, and it's just not going to be as crisp and clear. So that is the con of having a high ISO. So you don't want to have it too high. You need to know your camera because each camera has capabilities that are a little different. Like I said, the lower the ISO, the better. So what we have done now is we have set our aperture, all right? We put our ISO, let's say we'll put it at 100, okay? And now we're going to set our shutter speed. So our shutter speed is exposure time in seconds, all right? So if you ever look at your camera, sometimes you can hear it. You can hear the shutter open and close. What happens is our shutter opens to allow light and the image through, and then it closes, all right? And then once it's closed, no more light comes through. So as you can imagine, shutter speed also affects light. However, the longer that we have our shutter open, the more chance that we have of things not being in focus. Because if you can imagine, when the shutter opens, we are basically telling our camera like, hey, take a quick shot of this. So if you have a long shutter speed, let's say if you have it on like 1 second, if someone moves at all, all of that movement is being captured in that image. Okay, so we don't want a shutter speed that's really, really slow unless you're trying to capture something like light moving, or a car that's like driving down the road, and you want to grab like the kind of blur that it leaves. That's when you're going to leave your shutter speed really fast or slow, really slow. However, when your shutter speed is really slow, so if it is at that, like, 1 second or half a second or anything along those lines, you also have to take into account your
However,
shape.
the
on
longer
your camera.
it's open,
So
the
when
more
we
light that's
hold
going
our
to be coming
camera,
through. So
we naturally
it's
have
longer,
shape.
we
open,
naturally
more
have
light's going to be
movement,
coming
just
through,
like our
but
subjects
there's
are
more
going to have
chance
naturally
of
have
blur
movement.
and not
So
a
if I'm
crisp
holding
image.
my camera like this,
As much as I would like to stay still and say that I can stay still, like, it's not possible, especially for a full second. We're going to end up moving and everything's going to be around. So not only do we have to take into account our subjects moving, but we also have to take into account our movement as well. So shutter speed is going to do all of that. When you make the shutter speed a lot faster, so if it opens and closes real fast, you're not allowing a lot of light in, but you're able to capture the image very sharply. Okay, so there is a balance to all three of these. If you've noticed, there's been a pro and a con to all three. Aperture, it lets a lot of light in. It creates that beautiful, like, creamy background. However, there's a smaller area that you can get in focus, right? ISO, more sensitive to light. That's awesome. That means that all of your other settings can be super fast and you don't have to worry about light because ISO can go all the way up. Camera can be really sensitive to light. But the higher you go, the more grain, and it's just not going to be as crisp of an image. Okay. And then same thing with shutter speed. You can go really slow and let a lot of light in, but you're also going to be able to capture a lot of movement in your images. But if you make it super, super fast, your images are going to be too dark, okay? So with all three of these, we need to set them properly. So I'm going to tell you exactly how I set them and what I do when I realize, like, ooh, my images are too dark or too bright. What I do going back through it, okay? And we're going to troubleshoot it a little bit. So the first thing I do, like I said to you guys, is I set my aperture. When I shoot families, my aperture does not go below 3.2 if it's little children. This is just what I am comfortable with. I have been doing photography for a very long time, professionally for over 2 years, and that's just what I have found where I'm comfortable with. That does not mean that it is what you should do as well. Sometimes if you go to 3.2 and you're realizing it's still too narrow of a depth of field, meaning that's not enough space of what's in focus, then maybe you need to go up and you need to practice at a higher aperture. I don't go below 3.2 with little kids, and I don't go below 2.8 with older kids that are a family. Now, when I do like mom and dad, sometimes I'll dip below and I'll go to like 2.2 or sometimes 1.8. But typically when there's children and they're moving around, and I do like to capture a lot of movement, I play a lot of games, 3.2 is just where I'm comfortable, okay? So I set my aperture at 3.2 first, and then we're going to move on to ISO. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my ISO and I'm going to set it as low as I think I can go. So if it is a bright sunny day, my aperture is at 3.2, and I know I'm going to be letting a good amount of light in with that aperture, I can set my ISO to 100, and it'll be perfect, okay? It'll be perfect, all right? Then I move over to my shutter speed. My shutter speed, I do not make it slower than 1/320th of a second. So that's 1/320. I don't go below that. There's very, very rare times that I go below that. Some photographers will tell you 1/250th of a second. I've tried that before, and with moving children, it just doesn't work for me. So I don't go below 1/320th of a second. Again, this is how quickly your shutter speed opens and closes. So if you think if it opens like this and it opens like that, if your child is just like moving just a little bit or running or moving or like swaying like this, like the slower that shutter speed is, the more they're going to be blurred. So that's just my rule of thumb, okay? So let's say I did that. Let's say I did those settings. I did 3.2, ISO 100, and my shutter speed is 1/320. And I meter, and it is way overexposed, okay? Like the little meter is like way to the right. What do I do? I go ahead and I look at my image or my settings, and the first thing I say is, can I change my shutter speed? Can I move my shutter speed? Yes, yes, I can of course make my shutter speed faster, like, because there's no cons in making it faster except for it's going to allow less light in, which is what we need. We need less light if it's way overexposed. So I'm going to go ahead and lower my shutter speed down. Or sorry, make it slower, or faster. Oh my gosh. I'm going to make my shutter speed faster. So maybe I move it up to 1/500th of a second. So 1 over 500. See if that works. If I take another picture and it's still too bright, then we're going to move up, maybe 1/1000th of a second. Then, if it's still too bright, you still go up. And you continue that process, okay? All right, now let's go ahead and backtrack. Let's say I still have my aperture at 3.2, my ISO at 100, and my shutter speed at 1/320th of a second. And I meter, and it's way underexposed. That means I'm not allowing enough light into my camera to see my subjects. So what can we do? We can lower our shutter speed, but I've already hit my minimum. I don't want to go below 1/320th of a second. So I say I can't touch my shutter speed. I can't make that lower. So then I go back and I go to my ISO and I say, can I raise my ISO so I can let more light into my camera or like make my camera more sensitive to light? Well, it's at 100 and I know I can go up to like 16, 3200 for my ISO on my camera. So of course I can raise it. So let's say I raise it to 400 and I take a picture and it's still underexposed. Then I'm going to go ahead and raise it to 800 and then take a picture. And there we go. All right, now let's say if I hit my maximum on everything, let's say it's still underexposed when I have my shutter speed at 1/320th, my ISO is at 1600, and my aperture is at 3.2. What do I do then if it's still underexposed? Well, at this point, it just depends on how underexposed it is. If it's just a couple notches, then I'm fine with that. I can kind of brighten it up in Lightroom. That usually happens at blue hour when we're trying to push as many pictures as possible after sun has set. But not gonna lie to you guys, at that point in time, I usually either end the session or know I have to use a flash. So I personally do not like taking underexposed images because even when you brighten them up in Lightroom, you're more susceptible to grain and just it doesn't look as right. So I would much rather have a properly exposed image in camera. So those are the three things and how I have them work. I'm going to send you guys an exposure triangle, what it looks like. So it's got like aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, and it'll show you on there with pictures of like, hey, if you go too low, if you go this way, it's going to look like this. If you go this way, it's going to look like this. So all three of these like mesh together. That's what creates a properly exposed image in camera. So I encourage you to practice this, okay? Don't get discouraged because y'all, it took me a long time to figure it out. And there's no shame in that. It is a lot. With these three things, there's so much that goes into it because, you know, if you change one thing, it affects all the other things. So don't feel frustrated. If you have no idea how to use manual or you think you knew how to use manual, but now you're like, oh, well, I didn't realize if I did that, it would do this. I encourage you to take your camera out and take a picture and then look at the back and say, okay, these are my settings. What could I have done differently? And do that on every single image that you take. I still do it in Lightroom. If I see an image that's like a little like out of focus or something, I'll look at my settings. I'll be like, okay, well, what could I have done, differently? So I encourage you guys to do that. You guys have a fantastic day. If you have any other questions about exposure or manual mode, please let me know in the comments, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.